I can't hear it. I think I am, aren't I? Okay. We're in Genesis 41. If you would remember, we've been looking at the story of Joseph. Not Joseph, the father of Jesus, but Joseph, one of the patriarchs. In the story, he is the 11th son of Jacob. He is Jacob's favorite because he is the son of his beloved Rachel. Benjamin came afterwards. And Jacob was not shy about showing his preference for Jacob over all his other brothers. And as one would expect, his brothers were not crazy about him for him. We looked at all the reasons. And at one point, at one point he had dreams that said there was a time coming when they would all bow to him, which did not help him with his brothers. And then at some point, this is all reviewed, Jacob sent him out to a field to check on his brothers, which probably also did not endear him to them, just the very fact that his father was sending them out to check on them. And they sold him into slavery. You remember the story? He went into slavery in Egypt, and he wound up working for a man named Potiphar. His wife took a wicked interest in him, and when Joseph did not return the ardor, she lied about him. She falsely accused him of trying to rape her. Then he went to prison. Now, all of this took place over the course of about 13 years. And he was 17 when he was sold into slavery. And by the time the events took place that we're kind of looking at now, he was, or have been looking at, he was about 30 years old when he began to have these, or when these fellow prisoners started having visions, and he started interpreting them, and word got back to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh had a dream, and Joseph interpreted the dream, telling him that the two dreams were telling him that they were going to have 7 years of abundance and then 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh heard all of this, and Joseph gave him advice that he get someone to lead the country and pile up all the store for the famine that was coming. And what happened was Pharaoh decided there was nobody better than Joseph himself. So we're going to start looking at where we are as Pharaoh appoints him to be basically the second in charge of Egypt. And think about that before I pray. Think about just what a massive rise this was. He went from being a nobody's son of a nobody's sheep herder in Canaan to being a slave, to being a sex offender in a prison, which is what we would have called him today. And now all of a sudden he was the second in charge in what was then the superpower of the ancient world. Can God do miracles like that? He did do it. And as I'm going to show you tonight, it's all a picture of Christ. It's all a picture of Christ. So let's open in prayer, and then I'm going to give you a story that won't seem like it matches anything, but later on you're going to see why I told it to you. Let's open with prayer. Lord, I praise you for your word. I praise you that no matter how many times we read through it, you show us new things every time. And I pray that that would be true tonight, that we would be picking up from your word things that go beyond anything that we had previously known. I pray that you would give me an ability to speak that goes beyond my ability to speak, and I pray that you would plant in all our hearts things that would bear witness and bear fruit long after we've forgotten where we heard it. And I pray it in Jesus' mighty name. And all God's people said, amen. We will be in 41 through 45 to start. But let me give you the story first. When I was in my early 20s, I lived in downtown Denver, and I frequented a little old-fashioned diner called Pete's Coney Island. They had the orange, like, plastic seats, and they had a cook in the window. If you've ever seen such places, cooking the food in the window, you'd walk past and you smelled onions and potatoes and bacon, and you just had to go in. And every day I would go in there. I mean, every day I would go in there and have pancakes and bacon and coffee. And there was a waitress in there named Rosie. Wouldn't that be her name? And she looked like a Rosie. She was probably 60 years old. This is back in the 70s, or yeah, probably more like the early 80s. She had red hair that had probably been red, was probably gray now, and she was making it red again. Do you know what I mean? It didn't look real, but she had it. It was in like a beehive hairdo, and she had her little I don't know what you call them. Waitresses used to wear these little things in their hair, and she had the little thing at the top of all that hair. She had horn-rimmed glasses that were hooked to like gold beads around her neck, and she would drop them and raise them depending on when she needed them. She was bow-legged. She was flat-footed. She was a smart aleck. She was tough, and nobody messed with her, and she was the greatest waitress I ever saw in my life. She must have carried 13 plates at a time, just walking across the room like she was dancing. I think she'd been at it for decades, and she knew everybody in the room. I would walk into that room, and she'd say, "Hey, hon, your usual?" And I loved having somebody who knew what my usual was. And I'd say, "Yes, my usual." And she'd say, "Your seat's back there." I usually sat in the same spot. People in diners are like people in church. You usually have a spot. And I would eat my meals. Now, that was true for several years. But one day, I was out and about, and I saw somebody at a bus stop. And I knew her, but I didn't know who she was. And she looked at me, and I could tell she wanted to say hello. Now, if it were Katie, she would have walked up and said, "I don't remember who you are. Who are you?" But I just got flustered that I didn't know who this woman was, and I just kind of looked away and kind of moved away. And I couldn't figure out who it was. Who was this person? I'd seen her before. And then I got to the restaurant the other day, and she said, "How come you couldn't say hi to me at the bus stop?" And, of course, it was Rosie. And I thought about it at the time. What in the world happened to me that I didn't recognize this woman? Well, I realized what it was is she was not where she was supposed to be. She wasn't in the restaurant. Now, I don't know if way back in the back of my mind I was thinking the irrational thought that she only lived in that restaurant. When it closed, she just kind of went like this and waited until it opened again, or what. But when I saw her outside of the realm of where I expected her, I didn't know who she was. Have you ever done that? Okay, hold on to that story because it's going to be important later. Let's go to chapter 41 of Genesis, 41 through 45. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took off his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put the gold necklace around his neck. He had him ride in his second chariot, and they proclaimed before him, "Bow the knee!" And he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Though I am Pharaoh, yet without your permission no one shall raise his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." This is a literal story about Joseph. But as I've said before, Joseph is a picture of Christ. Joseph is the beloved of his father, who was rejected by his brothers. He was betrayed and sold to the Gentiles for a few pieces of silver. He disappeared just as though he were dead. And then in the end, he ends up coming back first to rescue the Gentiles and then to rescue the Jews. This is a picture of Christ. Let me suggest to you that this passage, where Pharaoh is bringing him along and proclaiming him as his second in charge and having people bow before him, is also a picture of Christ. Put a hand in here and go with me to Mark chapter 14. If you were in my Sunday school class today, we actually looked at this. Mark chapter 14. Jesus had an interesting conversation with the Sanhedrin when they were falsely accusing him on the night of his betrayal. And in chapter 14, towards the end of the Gospel of Mark, there's only 16 chapters, verses 60 through 62. People are bringing all kinds of accusations, false accusations about Jesus. And he's not saying a word. He's not saying anything at all. And in verse 60, is everybody there? It said, the high priest, which would have been Ananias, stood up and came forward and questioned Jesus, saying, "Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?" But he kept silent and did not answer. Again, the high priest was questioning him and saying to him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And watch what Jesus says. And Jesus said, "I am. You shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." What in the world is he talking about? Well, first of all, Son of Man was a title that Jesus frequently used for himself. He didn't walk around calling himself Son of God. He called himself Son of Man. And oftentimes, Christians will make the mistake of thinking that Son of God refers to Jesus' deity and Son of Man refers to his humanity, because he was fully human and full deity all at the same time. But Son of God is a term that can be used for others than Jesus. It frequently is. As I pointed out this morning, we are called sons and daughters of God. Angels in the Old Testament are sometimes called sons of God. Son of God does not necessarily mean deity, although in Jesus' case it ultimately does. But when Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, he's calling himself God, because it is a fulfillment of prophecy. In Daniel 7, verses 13 and 14, if I can get it up. Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, 500 or so years before Jesus said these words, Daniel wrote this: I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the what? Clouds of heaven, one like a who? Son of Man was coming, and he came upon the Ancient of Days. Now, who is the Ancient of Days? It's God. Ancient of Days is a term for God, and was presented before him. We are Trinitarian, are we not? Now, it boggles the mind, but the scriptures present a God who is one in essence and three in persons. One in essence and three in persons. The analogy that I used a few weeks ago is the closest thing to a good analogy I've ever heard. It's not perfect. Most of the analogies you hear about the Trinity wind up being heretical, but I can't find heresy in this one, is that this room is one room. But it has length, it has width, and it has height. All of them are present at the same time. If you eliminate anything of any of them, the whole room collapses. They're all codependent. They're all co-eternal, meaning as long as there is a room, there is width, length, and height. They are all together at the same time. It's not a perfect analogy, but this is the essence of what we have with the Trinity. It's mind-boggling, and what I always tell Muslims is perhaps the reason your God isn't mind-boggling is because he does, or let me put it another way, perhaps the reason that your God never goes beyond the realm of your mortal mind is because he originated in a mortal mind. The God of Scriptures is much harder to understand. He would be, wouldn't he? So here we have the Ancient of Days, and this Son of Man has been presented before him, okay? Now watch what it says. And to him was given dominion. That means full power. It doesn't mean dominion power, but it does mean he has dominion. He has rule over everything. Honor and a kingdom, so that all the peoples, how many peoples? All the nations and all the populations of all languages might serve who? Him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion. So how long will it last? Forever, which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. If he is eternal, then he is God. The Ancient of Days gives authority to the Son of Man. The Son of Man is the Son of God. The Ancient of Days is the Father. Now, when it talks about him coming on the clouds of heaven, that's what Jesus is talking about when they ask him. In verse 62, he says, I am. They said, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? He says, I am, and you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. He's saying, I'm the Son of Man. And by saying he's the Son of Man, he's saying, I am God. And how did they respond? Verse 63, tearing his clothes, the high priest said, what further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you? And they all condemned him to death, of deserving death. Jesus went to a cross because he claimed to be God. Now, that wasn't what Rome was caring about, but that's why the Jews hated him, is because he claimed to be God. Now, I want you to see this, because what we have is the Father giving rule and authority to the Son. And the Son rules over all peoples, and all peoples bow to him. Philippians 2, verses 8 through 11, speaking of the incarnation of Jesus Christ, it said, in being found in appearance as a man, meaning Jesus, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, death on a cross. For this reason also God highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee will bow of those who are in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and that every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of the Father. Go back to Genesis 41. I want you to see the typology here. Typology is symbolism. It's prophecy in symbolism. Genesis 41, Joseph is a picture of Christ in this passage. Chapter 41, verses 41 through 44, we're going to read those same verses again with the things I just taught you in mind. Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. You see, he gave him dominion, right? The most powerful gave the heir, the second in charge, he gave dominion over everything. Then Pharaoh took off his signet ring from his hand and put it in Joseph's hand and clothed him in garments of fine linen and the gold necklace around his neck, and those are the clothing of royalty. He had him ride in the second chariot, and they proclaimed before him what? What did they proclaim? Bow the knee. And he set him up over how much of the land of Egypt? All the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, though I am Pharaoh, yet without your permission, no one shall raise his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Did he give him dominion? Do you see the picture? Do you see the picture of Christ in this passage? Joseph is a picture of Christ. Pharaoh is a picture of God the Father. Joseph over and over is a picture of Christ. And in this passage, it is also true. Let's go on in the story. Verse 45. Now, this is not symbolism. This is just literal. 45, then Pharaoh named Joseph Zephanath-Paneah, and he gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar the priest of On, as his wife. And Joseph went forth over the land of Egypt, and that means he went to rule. Now, Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh. It means it's been 13 years since he was sold into slavery, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 years of plenty, and the land brought forth abundantly. So he gathered all the food of these 7 years which occurred in the land of Egypt, and placed the food in the cities. He placed in every city the food from its own surrounding fields. Thus Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he stopped measuring it, for it was beyond measure. Now, that's 7 years of abundance. He was 30 years old when he was appointed. 7 years of abundance means he's 37 now. His brothers haven't seen him since he was 17. The following story, we don't know how many years have passed between there. The story that follows is going to take place during the years of famine, but it doesn't tell us how many before he runs into his brother. But most scholars believe Joseph was about 40 years old by the time he runs into his brothers again. Over 20 years. Let's go on. Verse 50. Now, before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On, bore to him. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh, and Manasseh means he helps me to forget. You know, all his troubles, he's so happy with Manasseh that he names him, he helps me to forget. For he said, God has made me forget all my troubles and all my father's house. And he named the second Ephraim, for he said, God has made me fruitful. Ephraim means fruitful in the land of my affliction. Now, these 2 young men will be important later in the story. They become the half-tribes of Joseph. And it's interesting when you get to the book of Revelation, you find that 12 tribes are defined, and the tribe of Dan is missing, and the tribe of Joseph is missing, but both have been replaced by the half-tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. Verse 53, when the 7 years of plenty, which had been in the land of Egypt, came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, just as Joseph had said, then there was famine in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread, because they had collected it. Verse 55, so when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, you shall do. When the famine was spread over all the face of the earth, now you need to understand that doesn't mean over South America and North America and Europe. The scriptures frequently use this kind of language in regard to all the face of the earth that was then known to the people who lived there. In the New Testament, in fact, in Acts chapter 11, verses 27 through 28, we're told that Agabus made this prophecy. It said, now at this time some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and indicated by the Spirit that there would definitely be a severe famine all over the world. And this took place in the reign of Claudius. Now, some translations say all over the Roman world, but that's not in the Greek. But it's understood that it doesn't mean all over the world. It means all over the world that is in question in the story. It's the same here in Genesis. In other words, in Egypt and the lands around it, which would have included Canaan, there was famine. Does that make sense? All right, verse 57. The people of all the earth came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe in the earth. And this is where the plot thickens, verses 1 through 4. Now Jacob, Joseph's father, was been told that Joseph is dead. He's been separated from him now for over 20 years. Saw that there was grain in Egypt, and Jacob said to his sons, why are you staring at one another? I like that passage. Why are you just sitting there dying and staring at one another? He said, behold, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us from that place so that we may live and not die. Then 10 brothers of Joseph went down to buy grain from Egypt. Now remember, he had 12. One of them is in Egypt. What happened to the other? Well, verse 4. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin, who would have been about 17 by this time. Actually, he would have been older. He's about 20 years younger than Joseph. So he's in his late teens or somewhere around 20. With his brothers, for he said, I am afraid that harm may befall him. This is one of the indications. It doesn't specifically say it. But later on, Jacob will say things that make me think, and I'm not alone in thinking it, that maybe Jacob suspected something funky about the disappearance of his son. He's later going to say things to those brothers that make you think that he had a suspicion they had done something to Jacob. He doesn't want Benjamin going with him because Benjamin is the last son he had with Rachel. Rachel was his beloved. He loved his sons by Rachel more than he loved all the others, which was the beginning of the problem. And now he's not going to send Benjamin with him because Benjamin is more precious to him than the other 10 brothers are. All right, let's go on. Verse 5, the sons of Israel came to buy grain among those who were coming, for the famine was in the land of Canaan also. Now Joseph was the ruler over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Now why is this important? Genesis 37 verses 5 through 8, 20 years before, it said, then Joseph had a dream. You remember this? And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, please listen to this dream which I have had. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf stood up and also remained standing. And behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf. Then his brothers said to him, are you actually going to reign over us? Are you really going to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and his words. And I said before that sometimes you hear preachers and they'll say, Joseph was prideful. If he was prideful, it's not found in this passage. If you are a prophet, and Joseph was a prophet, and God gives you a word to share, you share what God has told you to share. If there's a vision, you share it. You don't hold it in yourself. If God has given it to you, he has given it to you for a reason. Joseph gave it to them, and they hated him for it. That's not unusual for prophecy. Prophets were almost never popular. Now watch, did you see what happened though in verse, what verse was that, 46? What was it? 6, verse 6. Now Joseph was the ruler over the land. He was the one who sold all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and what? Bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Now you need to understand, they have no idea who he is. Verse 7, when Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he disguised himself to them and spoke to them harshly. And he said to them, where have you come from? And they said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. In other words, he recognized them, and he didn't want them to recognize him. I don't think he had to do that much. First of all, Egyptians, they had a thing about body hair. They viewed it as unclean. They would shave their heads. They would shave their eyebrows and then paint eyebrows back on. They would shave off their beards and put pretend beards on their chins. People do the silliest things. But this is what the Egyptians did. They would shave their bodies. hair was unclean. This was not true of the Israelites. They grew their beards. Their beards went all over the place. Even the men did it. Nobody picked up on that. They grew their beards all over the place, and most likely even Joseph he may not have had too much of a beard at 17, but he might have had some, and he certainly had hair on his head the last time they saw him. Him as an Egyptian would have been unrecognizable to them. Another thing about him, though, is that it'd been over 20 years since then. Do we change over the course of 20 years? Yeah. Can I show you a picture of two people in this room a little over 20 years ago? Can I get it up there? You recognize the guy? When I was young? Anybody recognize that little girl? She was crawling over my shoulder. That was Livy. I don't know how old she was. She was a toddler. And you're 23 now? Yeah, so this is probably a little over 20 years. If you had seen her on the street 20 years ago and you saw her now, would you say, "You're that little baby I saw 20-some years ago"? Now, you know, maybe you'd look at him and say, "Aren't you that guy I saw 20 years ago?" We change and we're not always recognizable, especially if we shave off all our hair and shave off all of our beard. Now, let me give you a third reason they didn't recognize him. Do you remember the story I told you at the beginning of the sermon about Rosie? Did these men ever expect to see Joseph again? Did these men ever expect, if they did see Joseph, to see him as anything but a slave? Did they expect to see him as an Egyptian? Did they expect to see him as an Egyptian ruler? Would have been the last thing on their minds. He could have stood there and spoken to them and said he was Joseph. As we will see later, it still takes a little while for it to dawn on them who he is. So it is not unbelievable that, if I can have my last picture, that this Egyptian ruler is standing over these Jews after 20-some years and they have no idea who he is. He recognizes them because they haven't changed that much, but he's totally different and they have no idea who he is. Final two verses, verses 7 through 8. I'm lost again. Okay, when Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he disguised himself to them and spoke to them harshly. And he said to them, "Where are you from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." But Joseph had recognized his brothers, although they did not recognize him. And I'm going to stop there. So this is all the story you're going to get. You're going to have to look up it on your own. Are you following this? Did any of that make sense? All right. Could we do another song before we quit?